prop 1-to-1, EV unwrapped it 1-to-1, created 1 or maybe 2 materials for it, which is good. But when it comes to environments, and I've kind of said this a few times throughout the semester, we can't do that for every single prop. We don't have time, we don't have rendering resources, so it just can't be done. So we need to use a hodgepodge of different techniques throughout our environment to make it work. So ideally, your blockouts at a stage similar to this one. I'll run through really quickly what would be expected at the blockout stage. So we're looking at some kind of initial lighting pass and basic blocked out meshes for all of our major components. So in this case, nothing in here is detailed. It has a lot of the elements of the scene, but none of them are actually polished at all. We've got tables that are just a couple quads. We've got pillars that are just cubes. Ladders, same thing. Very little stuff in here actually has any kind of model detail just yet. And this is kind of the stage that your blockout should be getting to sometime soon. Once we have something like this in place, we can actually start to polish these models. So last week during the blockout example, which was a little bit less formal, a little bit more just going through it, we kind of showed how you can replace your meshes that already exist in the scene really quickly just by re-exporting them, right? So once everything's in place like this, you're good to go and start modeling your pieces. So how do we actually model those pieces? Well, we've got 2 main workflows that we're going to be using. The first one, again, you're quite familiar with. I'm actually not going to talk about this one too much because I think you all have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I will leave detailed feedback on all your assignment submissions. And towards the end of class, or maybe even after the slides before I start the demo stuff, I might go over the submissions live here, just scroll through them and note quick feedback because I did see a few things that were happening more frequently than I would have liked, and it was sort of similar issues throughout, so I might touch on those a bit. The other one you might have heard of, but probably not. How many of you know about weighted normals? Luis, Aiden, kinda, both not super confident raises. Essentially, weighted normals are how we're going to model the majority of our environment. And you can see there's a lot of key differences between the two. Low poly and high poly, like I said, the observation model. You've done it before. I did the carjack example for class, left it there. We created a high poly, baked it down, and had a low poly with proper normal maps, textures, and everything else. With weighted normals, this is going to be more for our modular pieces. So we're not going to be modeling unique detail for everything. There will be no bakes, most likely, maybe 1 or 2 different kinds using RGB masks. We'll learn about those later. But we're not going to be modeling a super specific amount of detail into every piece, baking it down, and then exporting it. We can fake our smooth edges in these modular pieces using weighted normals. So I have a quick example of what assets are going to be modular versus what assets are not modular. And then we'll look at what the weighted normals actually are. So this is from Sniper Elite 5, France. The artist is Kieran Goodson. I was reading some of his articles on this stuff before, so I figured I would use his example to cover how we can break down modular and non-modular assets. If you look in the scene, I've kind of painted not everything, but a lot of stuff in blue that is modular, and a lot of stuff in pink that is not modular. So you can imagine everything in blue is going to be reused somewhere else in the world, right? We've got these pillars that are being reused not once, but 3 times here, right? With the extension of that pillar just crashing into the wall. And you can see we've got the same pillar set up all the way down here as well. These modular pieces are the kind of pieces that are going to fit to a grid. They're the ones that we modeled mostly last class, right? And these ones in pink are the ones that are actually going to use unique details and unique sheets. Some of them might be set dressing, some of them might be more important than that. A barrel with specific barrel details, a bench with a very specific normal map. It's kind of hard to see on the projector, but there's a lot of intricate detail in that handle. All kinds of debris and army crates and everything else you can imagine in this kind of war-torn scene. These are all going to be individually modeled and have their own maps. So we need a good combination of both. To take that a step further, we also have unique and modular textures. So we haven't really learned much about modular textures yet. That'll really start next week when we start to use Substance Designer. This week we'll look at a modular texture type called trim sheets, but that'll be later down. When it comes to these unique textures, you can see it covers actually very little. So it's the same for the modular assets. A lot of the modular assets are also going to have unique textures as well. But 90% of our massive scene here is covered in these tileable, reusable textures that have no specific detail to our meshes. We can circumvent this by using things like decals. You see all these little posters and signs that are everywhere. Unreal finally booted up. We have posters and signs and details everywhere. We have a few set dressing pieces that might deserve their own normal maps and other maps. But for the most part, the majority of our scene, we're looking for ways to build it with tiling textures and non-unique geometry. So we're actually building out that geometry. We're looking at a few different shading methods. Flat shading, smooth shading, and smooth shading plus smooth groups. You'd be familiar with smooth and smooth groups as auto smooth in Blender. What it's actually doing is marking sharp edges between different polygroups that you choose, and in between each of those polygroups, it's going to shade smooth. So you can imagine what's actually happening here is that top set, because the angle is not changing very much, is becoming one smoothing group, and then the side is becoming a second smoothing group. The other two you should understand pretty inherently by now, smooth shading and flat shading. If I see flat shading on anybody's model, I'm going to be sad because it's like week 7, and you guys know better than that by now. So, between these three, which one obviously is the one that you're looking to be using 90% of the time? Right?
Third one.
Third one. Boom, smooth and smooth groups. You should set this up. You want this control over your assets. And that works great 90% of the time. But as we also know, we don't want these super sharp edges. This just looks bad, right? Every object in real life is going to have some level of roundness to it to catch that light. If we have a super sharp edge, there's nowhere for light to bounce off of and reflect back to us, and it doesn't look good. So we need to round these edges, but rounding these edges like this is expensive. If I just bevel every corner on my model, I'm going to be way over my poly count incredibly quickly. So what can we do? Let's say we add a bevel to this edge. I've got my same 3 shading models here, flat, smooth, and auto smooth. If you look at the flat shading, the part that's supposed to be round is clearly not round. That's not good. If we look at smooth shading, there's no weight to it. It just smooths the entire thing smooth. If we look at the smooth plus smooth groups, it looks pretty good. We are getting that reflected light, but we're still not getting that roundness that we're looking for, right? We can very distinctly see 2 different smoothing groups, one for this beveled portion and one for this flat portion. We need something that's sort of a middle ground that bridges the gaps between those smoothing groups, and that's where weighted normals come in. Right, so where auto smooth is going to make these distinct smooth groups, weighted normal actually picks up on those smooth groups and then blends between them. So instead of getting this sharp transition between smoothing groups here and here, we end up with a very smooth transition. It does exactly what you would think. It's a weighted average of the normals that are perpendicular to each other. So it kind of blends it all out. Okay, and I just did it again with the wireframe so you can get a better picture of the differences. It might be a little hard to see with the projector, I'm not sure. And yeah, right? We don't want that super sharp edge. That doesn't look realistic, that doesn't feel realistic. So we're looking to fake this high poly detail in our normals without actually creating any kind of high poly. Now there is one caveat. You can't weight a normal between 2 completely perpendicular angles. It looks basically the same as smooth shading. I don't have an example of it here, but just know that for every single edge we want to be smooth shaded, weighted normal, we are going to need a bevel, just a single bevel. But what that means is that for every edge you're adding, it's actually 2 edges on the final model. So it doesn't work for everything. Eventually we hit this barrier where the level of detail that we're trying to create with this bevel and this extra weighted normal, it exceeds what would have cost us to actually just make a high poly for it in the first place. Okay, so there is a bit of a balancing act to this. It's not something you'll just pick up in a day, which models you should use weighted normals for and which ones you shouldn't. Just note, if it has a lot of detail and you're really struggling to make consistent bevel lines throughout, probably it's something that you should just go with an individual mapped asset instead. Okay. And when I say individual mapped asset, I want to make something clear too. I'm not talking observational model. The observational model we did was meant to be what's called a hero prop. So I don't have this in my slides, but A hero prop is separate from just a normal set dressing asset. A hero prop is something that's likely going to be interacted with in some way. It's going to be close to the camera. It doesn't have to play by the normal rules. Topology counts, texture counts, none of that really matters when we're talking about hero props for the most part. Okay? Set dressing assets. I'm talking about your random things in your scene. A box, a crate in the corner, a barrel on the side, maybe a sign, right? These things don't need to be as detailed as your observational models by any means. They should be using way lower textures. And some of them could even get away with using weighted normals, but having unique textures. So you don't have to spend all that time making a high poly just to get a high poly looking result on those set dressing assets. Okay, so here's just an example. I took out those bevels on those inside corners, and it all falls flat. Weighted normals just breaks everything. If you did have a model that looked like this, you would be better off just using auto smooth and adding a specific bevel on those two corners. So here are a lot of examples that use weighted normals to sort of pretend they are something they're not. All of these modular set dressing assets align to a grid. They were used during last year's environment building demo for this class. And I can kind of hop in. I was opening this up so I could show you what's going on. So a lot of these pieces, rather than having those individual high poly meshes, they're just given a single bevel along these channels. And because these assets are so boxy by default, the single bevel really doesn't add too much. So it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the tops of these, right, all in these areas, you can see that single bevel and the way that it helps the light kind of reflect off of it, where we're not getting these super sharp edges. Okay, same thing down the side, same thing for the majority of the props in this scene. If we look at some props that don't have some weighted normals, like, I don't think this one does, right, we're still getting that super boxy, flat shading look. And we can't shade this smooth, obviously, because then it would look like a sphere. We need that middle ground of both. That's where weighted normals come in. So these large assets really benefit from that kind of stuff. We'll build a few props for our this year scene later on. And I'll kind of further demonstrate where you can use this stuff, right? So I just have it in the slides there too, so you can look at it later. But the idea is the same. All right, so that's the general principles of modeling for environments. Keeping it loose and quick. We'll do a little bit more live demo later. Any questions about that stuff? None so far. You'll definitely have questions come up when you actually start building your environments, because you get stuck on something and wonder which workflow to use, and you can just text me then and I'll help you out. Beyond the modeling though, we have another thing we need to worry about. Our models are good, they look pretty, our scene is built up. Now we have to worry about our environment UVs. So I've kind of talked about textile density a few times. This is a big portion of it, but there are a few other things going on as well. As it stands, you're pretty much used to using one UV set, more or less, for one object. Maybe you have two UV sets on separate material groups, but one UV set, one material. And in a vacuum, this is great, because as long as your object scale is applied, all of the textures, when you unwrap to a single UV set, are going to be even throughout your model. So I showed you this checker material before, I'm pretty sure. Everyone's familiar with the checker material? Okay. So the checker material is showing us our textile density evenness, more or less. And throughout, we're looking pretty good and even. But this prop needs to fit in an environment now. We're not just rendering it off in Substance Painter. We need to actually incorporate it into the world around it. And we can see if the world around it has some kind of textile density that our prop doesn't match, it's going to look a little bit funky. That's not to say it needs to be exact. Not every single prop needs to fit exactly into your textile density. It doesn't make sense. A lot of these props need more detail than the textile density of, let's say, the ground would allow. But it does need to be close. You do want it to fit in some capacity. So what are we looking at when it comes to textile density? Well, basically, we're just making sure that the number of pixels across a given real-world unit of space is the same. There are a few different ways to unwrap objects by default. If I take this, for example, this is a default unwrap. I didn't do anything to these cubes, I just unwrapped them, applied that checker material using the UV toolkit add-on I think I already told you to install. Okay. And this one is using properly textile density appropriate UVs, where the textiles, the pixels are the same size across the space on all the different models. Right? So if I have a 2 meter cube by a 2 meter cube, I should want 1024 by 1024 pixels to cover that space. The actual pixel density is up to you. If you have a technical artist on your team, this is something they should be deciding early on, as soon as you're getting around to texturing any of your environment assets. My recommendation, if you're working on Unreal, I would go 512 pixels per meter. That's kind of like the industry standard. It means you get 1K texture map per 1 meter of real world space, which tends to work pretty well. If you're really going for that high fidelity God of War look, then they probably pushed for 1024 pixels per meter, so a 2K per every 1 block. Okay. Why do we want to keep the pixel sizes the same? More or less, it boils down to the size of our details in our tiling, textures, and everything else. So if we have a texture, that texture's size is finite, and all of the details in that texture take up a certain amount of space on it, no more, no less. So in this case, with this substance designer material I made, it's just rocks and sticks. But as you can imagine, if I was going to apply this material to a bunch of different things in my scene, the rocks and sticks throughout my world should still be the same size. If the textile density is off, it's going to look like that first one, where the rocks on this one are so incoherently small, and the rocks on this one are way larger than everywhere else. Right? But by matching the textile densities, we get rocks that are the same size, no matter what surface they're on, or what size prop. We do this by adjusting the UVs. So this is an example where everything is just default. It's taking up the maximum amount of space possible on the UV space. We've filled up that 0 to 1 space as much as possible. Okay? Fine. But we're seeing the very clearly different size squares on our checker material. This is the UVs adjusted so that the squares on the texture show up the same size on the models all throughout. You'll notice that the bigger the object, the bigger the UV has to get to actually even out the number of textiles across. Okay, so this small one is, I believe, a 2 meter long cube. So the face, or no, it's a 1 meter long cube. So the face fills up a quarter of the texture, each face. But on the massive cube, which I think was 16, it takes 4 of this map to fill that face, right? So here's just a quick GIF. Sorry, it's really low resolution, but you should kind of get the idea. As we grow the texture, we're covering more and more pixels, which means we're getting more and more detail, right? And that's reflected in the checkers. To actually kind of handle this stuff, you're going to need an add-on. It's not really possible to do in Blender by default, unless you're like eyeballing everything or doing math. So hop into your Blender preferences, and you're going to be looking for a textile density checker. Luckily, it is one of the ones supported by Blender Cloud, so it's very easy to install. If I just pop open Blender here, I already have it installed, but I'll show you how to install it. It's a really good add-on. It's free. I don't know what else I need to say about it to sell you on it. It takes 3 seconds to download. You might as well. So I'll crack open Blender. If you go to Edit Preferences, you'll find add-ons or extensions. If you have a downloaded version of Textile Density Checker, you can install it here through add-ons. If you're looking for the web version, you can install it through extensions here. So it's just Textile Density Checker. Okay, it's the one by Ivan Vostrikov. So once you have that installed, it's a very useful tool because what it allows you to do is tell Blender, hey, I want this prop to have some sort of textile density. So if I hop into the UV editing here and hop into my panel, textile density now shows up at the bottom. And I can use this in combination with UV Toolkit, the one I already have you install, to make sure that this object has a consistent textile density. So let's make a new cube, and I'll actually just quadruple the scale of this one. Okay, and we'll give both of these a checker material using UV Toolkit. So at the bottom of UV Toolkit, you'll find a bunch of quick presets for materials, including the Blender checker material. So this just makes it really quick and easy. So if I hit 512 now, I can hit 512 on this as well, right? So both of these are using that 512 size checker material, but the squares are way different sizes. If I hop now into texel density, we can do a few things. The first thing I would recommend, if you're following along here, which I'd also recommend you do, is just go up to units, and by default, it's set to pixels per centimeter. We're working in environments, so we're not really worried about such nitty-gritty things. We're more working pixels per meter. So we go pixels per meter. We tell the add-on what size our texture is going to be. Remember, we usually make these tiling textures beforehand, so we know, okay, our technical artist on the project has told us that our tiling textures are going to be 1K, or they've told us they're going to be 2K, or they've told us they're going to be 512. Once we know that, we can pump that in here. So in this case, this checker material, because we made it just a second ago, we know it's 512. I'm just going to go ahead and hit 512. And under texel density here, right, based on that little example, we're going to go 512 pixels per meter. So for every 1 meter of real world space, we're going to have 512 pixels. And once that's done, we can just hit this set TD button, okay, with our UV selected. And it's going to fill the space. We can do it again for this object's UVs.
It's already set to.
And you can see now we are looking at even texels between both objects. If I go into the side view here, they are all the same size. Okay, I've been going over this a lot, but there's good reason for it. This is immediately noticeable if it's wrong. I'm just using a checker texture material here, so it's not as noticeable because it's just a bunch of repeating squares. But if you have detail on these objects, whatever kind of detail it might be, I will immediately point it out in Engine without like a moment's notice, because all of these wood grain details would be different sizes, right, in your game, which is immediately noticeable. And if you have even 2 props using it, it's easy for us to compare and contrast. Okay, so pay attention to that, make use of that add-on, play around with it a little bit if you're unfamiliar, but it's only like 5 buttons, so it's not too complicated. We do have a problem with this though. As I just demonstrated, when we start to make our objects really big, we run out of UV space, right? We only have that 0 to 1 space, and these objects are getting so big that to get enough pixels, they have to get larger than that 0 to 1 space. But there are 2 really key things that we can utilize to solve this problem, right? So here's the example. If I've got 16 meters by 16 meters, even at 512, right? If you do 512 times 16, you're getting more than a 4K map. I can't fit this on a 4K map. And there's no way you should be making an 8K for this kind of stuff. Please keep it below 4K. These textures, environment textures, should not go up to 4K, right? Like 2K at max. But there are 2 elements of UVs that are super useful to us. One is that UVs repeat. And this one, I don't think I need to explain too much. You should be pretty familiar with this concept by now. I'm pretty sure you even explored it in modeling 1. The UVs repeat. Once it extends over the edge of that 0 to 1 space, it's going to come back. So if I have something half off the UV, that other half is just going to take over on the other side. Okay? Another one that's new to you, probably, is that one object or one mesh can have multiple UVs, right? And there really isn't any particular limit to how many UVs these things can have, but you kind of already know this as well. You just haven't realized it yet. If you've put any model into Unity, it's had 2 UV sets, right? Whether you like it or not. You didn't make all 2 of them, you only made 1, but Unity automatically makes the other one and calls it a light map pack. So if you've seen light map or anything like that, all it actually is a second set of UVs that Unity generates, and when it's baking down those light maps, it uses that UV set instead. So every object you've already put in Unity has 2 UVs. We can do more. Well, you don't have to have it generate a light map, but more or less. You can do more though. we can have an object with one UV set for a texture and a second UV set for some other kind of procedural nonsense we want to do, or a third UV set for RGB masking or anything else, right? And one such use case, probably the biggest one you're going to be using, is trim sheets. So is anybody familiar with what a trim sheet is? Just off rip? Not really? Okay, perfect. Trim sheets are pre-built textures that we model from, sort of, in a way. Basically, instead of modeling out a bunch of stuff and then texturing it, what we can do is actually model a bunch of stuff, take individual pieces, think about ways we can reuse them, create a texture for them, and then model from that texture into a bunch of different shapes and sizes. This is a pretty basic trim sheet. I just nabbed it off Sketchfab as an example piece, and you can see all the different things that were made with that one trim sheet. So this all has one material, and the way that each object actually utilizes that material is different, and all it is adjusting UVs, adjusting and manipulating UVs. So what happens is we generate some assets like this, where we know we want some cobbled bricks, we know we want some gold bands and some gold bars and other pieces. We can take those and put them all together in that real world space to figure out how big each part should be on our texture. And then take that into something like Substance Painter or Substance Designer and start texturing it. And then, I mean, that's it. We have detailed textures for a bunch of different models without having to individually texture each of them. Determining what to actually put on a trim sheet is complicated, and it does take some time. I do want to demonstrate. Last year, what we did with the trim sheets was I made this entire environment with one trim sheet. So anything you see here that is wood is the same one material. So I haven't textured anything really in this environment. I just made one texture and that was it. So whether it's this or that or this thing or any of the other stuff, right? It helps when it's all one material, in this case wood. We can actually look at the texture, and it is just a trim sheet. Okay, so this is the wood trim sheet made last year using baking and Substance Painter, which is a similar process to what we're going to be doing today. But we can see a bunch of repeating detail and a bunch of little destroyed edges in between that we can apply to all these different edges. So it's kind of hard with one monitor, but something like this might have UVs for this particular plank, and then a different set for this particular plank that matches the size, and we get a nice edge on the corner because the edge is actually baked into our trim sheet, but the geometry itself is incredibly simple. Pretty sure it's just a cube, basically. Okay. The key thing with this is we need to have detail that repeats in one direction. Trim sheets are useless if we're trying to repeat detail in two directions. That's when we just use tiling textures, which we're going to learn about next week, and then you'll have a submission based on it. Assignment 2 is creating your own tileable textures using Substance Designer. But for this, trim sheets, they're going to be really useful if you have detail repeating in one direction. And these can repeat in one direction infinitely, right? If I take an object like this, it doesn't matter how long it is, we can still fit it onto our textile density sheet by just having all of those UVs extend past the 0 to 1 space, right? And because it repeats, we know it's going to tile properly all the way down. There are a few different ways to make it tile. I'm actually going to demonstrate, and we're going to kind of build one together here while we go through the new scene that we're making for this year. And we'll answer any questions, go through the modeling to observation submissions, and go from there. So I think, yep, we'll get into making trim sheets here. It's not really something I can show you on paper, so we're just going to have to kind of get into things and do it. Any questions so far, though? Cool. So let's hop in here. I've worked on the environment not very much. I didn't want to jump too far ahead, so I kept it pretty tame. It'll open soon, probably. Has anyone started their block out? Is everybody working and getting kind of into, sort of?
I did get my pieces ready, I just didn't block it out yet.
Gotcha. Okay. I'd recommend getting an engine as soon as possible, even if it's just for initial composition setups. Your composition and lighting right away will set your mood, so you can do that at any time, probably at the beginning though. Let's wait for this to boot up. Do keep in mind there are not that many weeks left, and you do have that environment submission, so try to keep on top of it as much as you can. All right, so here's where we were at. It's more or less a loose blockout. I haven't really touched anything too much. I think I worked on it for like 30 minutes after class last week, and that was it, just to make the bar look a little bit nicer. But more or less, everything is still the same. So now what we can do is we can start to approach this scene in terms of what assets are going to benefit from something like a trim sheet. So I'll just open this up here in my very official painting software. When we're examining our blockout that we've made, let's think about the things we talked about today and kind of break down our scene, and you'll be doing the same thing to your scene as well. So the first thing we're going to look at is weighted normals. Where can we apply weighted normals? Where do we not need specific model detail? And this also is a lot easier when you have reference, because it will tell you where you want your detail and where you don't. So let's look at some of our references here. I think this was our key reference, the one that we're looking at the most. And right away, we're seeing a few things. We have a lot of opportunity for repeating textures here and in the bar as well, right? So this is a prime candidate to where this kit can use its own trim sheet. We can make a trim sheet that is specifically just for these pieces here, okay? To further tell if this is a good idea, we can check how we're repeating our detail. You can see we have a lot of this slim but repeating detail in a single direction, where I know, right, and this is something that would come with time, but I know that this object, being a meter tall or so, is easily going to fit onto a trim sheet. If we have a single 2K trim sheet, we can kind of block things out roughly. We know a human is not quite 2 meters, so we could say maybe this is 2 meters here. This would take up approximately that much space on my trim sheet. Okay, and so we can determine from that that this is kind of an acceptable size. This isn't going to overwhelm the entire trim sheet. We'll be able to share the rest of this space with other stuff. Right, what other stuff can we share that with? Well, we could make sections for these. They don't need a lot of individual detail. They're pretty small props that are going to be repeated throughout. We could also take the God of War approach and make a hyper-specific sculpt, high poly, and detailed individual map for this piece. Since we are repeating it a bunch of times throughout the scene, it wouldn't be the end of the world either. But because today I'm demonstrating trim sheets, and because you kind of already understand that sculpting workflow, we'll decide to not give these unique textures. Where else? Well, we know we also have a lot of repeating detail up here. This is currently separated into 4 distinct pieces. Where each one of these could have a portion on the trim sheet as well. Be it this bottom bar, this middle bar, or this top bar. For weighted normals, if we look at our reference again, we have these nice detailed arches that we're going to have to model on top, but there's nothing actually in the arches that demands any kind of super high density detail, right? They're pretty smooth overall. We've got a couple edges, but nothing crazy. So this is a prime candidate for using weighted normals along here. Areas like the bar here, right? We don't want to create a high poly, but we do want that nice high quality shine, and we also don't want to make this 9,000 polygons because we're repeating this piece over and over and over. Okay, weighted normals we can apply down here, here, anywhere that we have a slight edge. So with that said, we can kind of work our way into our pieces and start to adjust them. File management is very important because all of these pieces are going to sit on that origin point. what I'd recommend you do is build a second version of the scene just to the side, just a small diorama with these same pieces using Alt-D. So Alt-D you should be familiar with. It creates an instance of something as opposed to a duplicate. So if I was to edit this one, it's going to edit the one in my scene over there, right? So not only am I seeing the pieces at an individual way, but I'm also seeing how they fit together over here, making sure that everything is tiling and connecting properly. So let's grab some of these pieces that we know we can turn into pieces with weighted normals. And we'll go over how to actually create that effect. So what I want to do for this piece is we know that all of these sides, the back, the top, the side, are not going to be visible. So we can delete all those faces. And then we do want to create a weighted normal effect here. So what we're going to do is first hop in, and I'm just going to use / to isolate and turn my keys on. I'm going to go into edge select mode and just select all of these crisp edges. So any edge that would be sharp, quote unquote, right? Any edge where we would see a difference in shading in our auto smooth, I'm going to just mark. And then I'm going to use the item panel to increase my bevel weight. Oh, that's the vertices for the edges. Okay, you see them turn blue. This bevel weight allows us to add a bevel modifier that only affects these marked edges. So I might have shown this before already, but I'll add that bevel modifier. Instead of limit angle, we're going to limit weight. Okay, and we get a nice bevel edge just where we want it. We're going to want to shrink this edge down quite a bit. We just want it to catch a bit of light. And the reason I'm doing it this way with bevel weights instead of an angle is it just gives us more control. You could use an angle and it would, in this case, for this prop in particular, give you the exact same result, but for this, it's better to just mark everything yourself. So under profile, under geometry, I'm just going to change this miter outer to arc. If you're going to use the bevel modifier for anything, you should basically do that every single time. Clamp overlap is fine. And again, we just want a single edge here. So let me turn off the wireframe so we can see. All right. By default, with our smooth shading, it looks a little bit funky. So we're going to add a weighted normal modifier. So it is in the modifier stack. It is non-destructive. We can add it on top. And now you can see it's actually averaging out these groups. We still have this fairly smooth edge in between, but we're averaging out all the groups. You can increase the strength that each face has. So at default, it's 50. But if I bumped up to 100, it's going to take this face and try and keep the shading within that face as flat as possible, right? Whereas 50, it's keeping it mostly flat. And if I go to 0, it'll look like regular smooth shading. Threshold controls how far between the normals it needs to be before it actually considers them the same. So in this prop, because they're all so stark, it wouldn't really make a huge difference if I change this. You can kind of see it in here. So it's determining the same way the automatic normal does, how different do these faces normals have to be before it's considered a different plane. By default, it's pretty good. So we'll leave that as 0.01. And that's it, right? Incredibly simple. But if it's that simple, why didn't I just click this and make a bevel? Right? I could have just gone in here and used Control B and just gone boom. Well, two reasons. One, with it being on the modifier and it being non-destructive, I can easily come back in and decide that this highlight is not enough and just increase it, right? If I wanted a bigger highlight. For weighted normals, we're almost always going to keep the segments at 1. We don't really need 2. You'll see it doesn't really do anything effect-wise because we're just averaging, if we add another one in between here, which doesn't really do much for us. The bigger effect is when we have just 3 faces. The other reason to use modifiers this way is because we are likely going to have other props in the scene and we want to keep everything consistent. not everything is going to have the exact same edge weight, but it wouldn't make sense if we had like an absolutely massive edge here with the weighted normals, and then on this one it's like the tiniest thing and you can't even see it. So to keep everything consistent, we can get started by making our bases like this, and then by clicking some other mesh, clicking our existing mesh, or is it, yeah, we can hit Control and L to link those modifiers. So by default, it's just going to break because we didn't mark any of our bevels. So let's go in here, we'll mark those bevels. Item, bevel crease, boom. And then delete those back faces because they're not going to show up anyway in the scene. Okay, and now this object shares that exact same profile as our other object. You can make absolutely sure they say the same by changing offset to absolute. So offset is going to make use of the existing geometry and sort of bevel as if you're adding an extra edge loop. Absolute is going to say, hey, no matter how my edge is, no matter how far off it gets, and no matter what the geometry is around, I'm always going to bevel a certain amount. So this can cause inconsistencies within a mesh, but it's more consistent between multiple meshes. I'm going to leave it at offset because this level of difference is good enough for me. As long as your scale is applied to everything, it shouldn't be too bad. So that was a small change, but let's export these now into the engine, and you'll see what a difference it makes. We're probably going to go through, and we could do this for every single prop. So I'm going to just quickly use my presets. We have the modeling 2.1 that we made, and then we'll just hop in to the project, which is here. Not there, here. This is the arcade top 2 meters. Okay, and it just gives us a much nicer, smoother edge here. This bit where it's freaking out is just because we didn't re-UV it, so the UVs are freaking out a little bit, but you can see it over here. And let's do the same for this. What'd I do? Oops. Four meter. Okay, boom, much nicer. That level of extra geometry is way cheaper on our engine, our rendering, than creating an entirely new texture and an entirely new material. So do use this when you can. So let's go through here and we'll clean up a few more. Other ones involving hard edges could be like these top pieces of the bar. If I grab this piece, right now it's set to smooth by angle. We can add a weighted normal. And that bevel to give it a more smooth appearance. Single bevel, angle. Okay, we can export this bar top. And for the corner, we're going to do the same thing where we're going to just copy over our settings. And then re-export our corner. Okay, great. So we've got a lot of pieces now with nice smooth geometry. And we could keep going, but I think the point is made there. I'm going to move this down. Okay. So that's the weighted normal elements of things. Let's look at where we can start building a trim sheet. We have a bunch of different geometry that we can use on this trim sheet, which is great. We have an entire set here that we can use. To start us off, I'm going to look at these pieces here. In our reference, right, we've got a few different types of high detail areas. So we've got these larger rectangle bits, and we've got these kind of conical bits, and then we've got these smaller rectangle bits. So we want to take our pieces and I'm actually going to duplicate them and just move them somewhere off to the side. Okay, and I'm going to look for a bunch of other pieces that would sort of also benefit from a trim sheet like this. Anywhere that we have that repeating detail. So where else can we see it? Something like this, we could even not model at all and just have this on the trim sheet. Because it's so low, I think I'm honestly going to do that because it's so far away from our player's point of view. So rather than having the extra geo there, on these pieces, we can just fake it. So I'm also going to grab this piece and just move it up. So we have a few pieces now that we can use. Maybe we'll also grab one of these and move that out. Good morning. And we have a few pieces here to get started, right? And these pieces are going to dictate the size of a lot of the trims on our sheet. So now we actually have to make the sheet itself. To do that, we're going to think about the size that we want our texture to be so that these can fit to some kind of textile density. So roughly these pieces, if we're going to put them all in one trim, we need the trim to be 1, 2, 3, 4 meters probably, right? And 4 meters at 512 pixels per meter, 4 times 512 is 2048. So we know that if we make a plane, a new plane, scale it up to be 4 meters, 512, 512, 512, 512, this is one physical representation of a 2K map. And as long as we stick to this, everything we put on it will be the same size and texture and in the world. So I'm going to grab those things we just kind of made, and I'm going to just make a new group, call it trim sheet. You can make a new file for this kind of stuff because you will probably want a new file eventually for it anyway. I'm going to hide everything else right now, and I'm just dealing with these. So now that we have this, our origin points and everything doesn't really matter. We're just looking to approximate the size of everything before we start modeling. So this piece, we don't actually need this detail here. That's not what we're doing with this trim sheet. What we're looking for is just the size of how large do we need this plain wood to be, right? We can see it's pretty close to the size of the other piece we have. So we don't really need a specific one for this. We can just reuse this size-wise. So right now, we've totally forgotten about what these are. We don't care anymore. We're just thinking about the size. I'm going to line these up, and we're going to be working from one of the corners and trying to fill this sheet as much as we can, where the textures trim all the way across. We'll start with these just because we had them already. I'm going to use snapping. Grab these two. And in edit mode, I can use snapping up here with active vertex to snap that entire piece to that corner. And we know we need this much size on our textile, our trim sheet, sorry. I'm going to duplicate it a second time, right? So this one we can imagine is going to contain the detail for those long rectangles and short rectangles. However we decide to break it up. This next one, if we're going to use it on other pieces, we probably don't want those rectangles, right? So I'm going to make a second one, move it down. And we have a second line here. We just make this one large long piece. Separate, separate. Okay, now for this piece as well, our bottom piece here, I'm going to take off the planes that we kind of want. I'm going to replicate this detail here in our trim sheet. I'm going to ignore kind of making one for each of these smaller sections and just make one big piece using this. This top section will use a different part of the trim. So we can delete that and just take this and move it down to our next section. And ideally, because of the way textile density works, you're going to want a bunch of different size pieces here. If they're all the same size and you have a small part on your kit, you won't be able to find a trim piece that fits, right? If they're all too big, you won't have any part of your trim that you can use for that either. Let's see where else we can use this kind of stuff. I'm seeing these edges here that we could repeat or we could model, kind of leading towards just modeling that. Where else do we have repeating detail? Let's look up here. Here's another great candidate for repeating detail. You've got a bunch of these different planes with all kinds of small details that we don't want to actually render in our scene. So let's make some of these. We can get 1, 2, 3, 4, potentially 5 trims out of this top piece that we can reuse throughout the rest of our scene. So we don't have to use these as they're kind of presented here. I could take this piece or this detailed piece and I could use that somewhere else if I wanted to save resources. So let's grab that piece from our block out. Which piece is it? That's this one here. I'm going to duplicate this, move it to the side, trim sheet. Back to trim sheet. Okay, so this is a bunch of new trims we can use. For no particular reason, I like to order these just to keep them from the most detailed at the top to the least detailed at the bottom. There's no specific rhyme or reason for this. It just helps keep things organized. So we'll move this one into the corner and we'll extend it all the way across. Snap. Join. Snap. Snap. Now we can always make trim sheets later down the line. I'll actually move this plane back so we can get an idea, right? As you can kind of see, we're building up this trim sheet piece by piece. I'll show you quickly what a final trim sheet looks like so you can get an idea. Maybe it'll help you kind of see where we're going with this. If I open. It's for a different project, but essentially I've created, and in this one, I created this trim sheet before I even modeled anything at all. It's just a series of these trims that we've created at those different scales and sizes to texture a bunch of different assets within our set. We also have these floating decals here at the bottom. We'll make some of those as well to cover some of the more finer details that we have here. For example, these little things, we probably don't need to model those out. We'll just include them in a texture, and to actually include them in the texture, we want them to be part of the same kit, but we don't want them to be part of any of the other trims. We can take these smaller details and later put them on top in our rendering of the other details. So this is kind of what we're working towards right now. It'll look something like this when we're done, and then we'll get into kind of texturing it and everything else. Another great thing about these trim sheets is the details can be as fine as we want. We're just baking this down to a texture. Think of this as creating like a high poly. we're not worried about keeping this at a low resolution. I'm going to subdivide and mash and do everything I can to make these pieces look as good as possible, right? And I'm not going to worry about resolution. So here, with these two pieces, they work better kind of as those decals because they're going to be one-to-one. So I'm going to move them to the bottom. Again, no rhyme or reason, but come up with a system that works for you that's consistent. So if you have other artists on the team, they know where they're going to kind of find this stuff. So let's say we're happy with this. I would typically probably go back and add a lot more different variations and sizes, but we can kind of cheat that. Right now, it looks like what we're missing the most is small details. So I'm just going to take this piece. That's going to be our plain wood piece. It's good to plan these out in advance. This is our plain wood piece here. I can also just cut it in half. So I'm going to scale it 0.5, move it up, drag it down again, scale it 0.5 on the z-axis. Okay, and now I've got 3 decent sized plain pieces of wood. So I can use these on any part that just needs plain wood without a lot of detail. Let's move our other pieces back in. Boom. So at this point, whatever space is left here, I would use for decals, but we don't know what decals we're going to use yet. We should probably go through and do that. If I was you, I would go through and do that, but for our purposes here, to keep it, you know, from me just standing here modeling for the rest of the period, we'll move on. So now that we have a good idea of all the different size trims, let's get to actually blocking a lot of these out. So this is where having that good reference and everything is going to come in, because you're going to want to create essentially the pieces at the highest resolution. So you still have to do the high density modeling for some of this stuff, but the trick is you only have to do it once. So I'm seeing at the top here, I like that we have this piece and then it's got this barricade down here. I could actually just use this again as another set of plain wood and then have this as a second option. It's hard to see with the details, but I'm pretty sure it's sort of a round kind of shape. So let's start punching that out. Purif is fighting me. I'm gonna grab this edge and just move it up. I wanna get rid of all of our weighted normal stuff that we had because we're gonna be working probably with sub-D here. I'll create a much larger chamfer where that detail is going to sit. And then we can kind of work in the shape from the side. So I'm just going to side view because it makes it a lot easier to adjust. And I'm not looking for perfection here. For now, to get started, I just want a good idea of what the shape is like. You can use sub-D or you can use just bevels. Up to you. Bevel this one out. Okay. So that's looking pretty good for this section. And then we have that hard cutoff. And we are paying attention to the height. When we bake this down, it will create a good height map that we can use for creating additional detail and that we can put into something like Substance Designer. So I am going to worry about the height here. We do have these little pieces along the middle portion of this, so I'm going to recreate those as well. It's kind of hard to see, so we're just going to make some details up, but for the most part, it's all going to be there. To make it easy on myself, I'm just going to use this front plane, divide it up a bunch of times. And then cut the additional ones. How far apart? We don't know how large these pieces of wood are. We do know since this needs to tile, we have to make sure that if we're going to have a piece here, how is it going to tile over on the other side? So this looks fine and dandy as it is, but if I were to keep this, what's going to happen is it's going to repeat from here, and then I'll have one that's double the length. So I don't want that. I am going to delete one of these and kind of move these into the middle. If you're unsure about moving something exactly into the middle, what you can do is create a proxy. It's pretty simple. I'm just going to create a plane, move it to the origin, and move it up, and then just create an edge down the middle. So now I have something that is perfectly lined up with the world center, and if I ever want to snap to the world center, I can just use that for my snapping. So now I know this is perfectly centered. Because we're baking normal maps here, if you remember during that other talk about the normal maps and stuff, these need to be a little bit sort of tapered. They can't be totally flat like this. If you look at this from a flat perspective, well, the shadows are turned on. But typically if you looked at this from a flat perspective, you wouldn't actually see any of those edges. So when we bake, it's going to be similar. So even if the objects are like this in real life, we are going to have to kind of come in and tweak it to make them bake a little bit better. So let's add just an edge here, chamfer. Chamfer is all around the sides. Just small ones. To give us a little bit more to work with. The other piece, I think it looked like there was a little bit more detail in the bottom here as well. So I'm going to create a new piece here. Extrude it up a bit. Let's see if I can't add that as well. Okay, and this piece also is going to need some kind of bevel detail. You can delete the faces on the edge. They're not going to be needed, as well as the faces on the bottom and the back. Some of these, if we leave, will cause shading inconsistencies later when we bake, so it's a good idea to get rid of them as much as possible. If it's not as smooth as we like it, we can always add a subdiv and then just adjust the geometry accordingly. All right, we're not too worried about topology here. We just want to make sure that we have the shape and we have a good shading. On this edge, at the back and this side, I'm going to make sure that I snap it all the way to the end, because otherwise it's not going to tile perfectly from this side to that side. Right, maybe we like the detail, maybe we don't. We'll see when we actually start putting things together, but I felt like it needed something more. So we have a couple of the details, and it's going to be this similar process for the majority of our parts. I might have one here that's just a small bevel. Not every single one needs to be incredibly fancy, because we can find use cases for 90% of these. So that one's just a small bevel, no problem. We'll do the same for this, and we can use this just as a small extruded piece. So our trim sheet's starting to come together. This one we don't actually have to do anything because it's just a plain piece of wood. What we might do later is go sculpt in the wood, which is what I did for the other one, or we can just texture it separate. So I'm not going to ignore that one for now. And then here, which one is this? Oh, this is another one of those just basic wood ones, so we can ignore it. Another basic wood, and then this next trim. So let's quickly create the high poly detailed version of this, which is just going to be a matter of kind of coming in here and beveling all of this. Popping a weighted normal on it. And I do want to adjust this more because I don't think this will bake super well since it's not tapered. So I'm just going to bring this up and bring this down. Just to give us more of an edge. Okay, and then finally with some of our decal pieces here, I'm going to start to think about those extruded details. So where are they? We're looking for some kind of frame here. It's not going to match reference 1-to-1, but we have a pretty good idea. So I'm just extruding this bit to create that first part of the plane, then we'll bridge to create the hole. I don't need this to be part of the wall geometry, I can just mash it all together after. And then we need another one that's smaller. With a chamfer. Right, it looks exaggerated because it is, but just with the nature of baking, we need to exaggerate as much as we can. Okay, with the good base setup, we can actually start to get in and create the finer details. It's looking to me like it's actually a totally separate piece. And we'll delete the backs. We can create the round edge by creating another edge ring here and just moving it out. And then beveling it back to where it was. And then beveling the corners as well. There's a little bit more detail in here, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. I don't want this to take forever. We could always add one more piece. And bevel these edges as well to catch the light. Great. I'll take the same piece, and for our smaller square, I'll just duplicate it and make it smaller. Okay, if I want to line it in the center of this, it's the same technique as a proxy. I'm just going to add an edge loop that I know is down the middle. Find the middle of this, snap, I know it's perfectly in the center. I'm going to do the exact same thing for this one just to make sure. It should be, but snap, directly in the center. Perfect. just going to duplicate both of these now and move this over. And because we're using pieces that we made from our kit that are exactly 4 meters, this is perfect, or 2 meters, sorry, this is perfect. And we can have 2 1 meter size pieces here that snap perfectly to the grid. So, boom. And now we have room for our third detail, which is just the same thing, more or less, but it's a cone. So we'll get rid of this backdrop, make this one a lot bigger. And then bevel these over. Sure, we'll just roll with that, it's fine. Okay, and at the root here, it looks like there's a little bit of extra detail that we can kind of sneak in. Cool. All right, and we still have a bunch of room down here for extra decals. So now we have something like this. All of our heights and scales are more or less figured out. We can delete this top plane since it's not going to exist. I'm going to take our plane here and just move it back to the world origin. Move it back a little bit, actually. Okay, and we're going to be baking just a flat plane to all of this. So I'm going to take my flat plane here. I'm going to export it just as we normally would. I'm using OBJs because I want the most limited amount of detail or extra data, sorry, possible. Let's put this on my desktop and we'll call this trim sheet plane underscore load. Do all the usual stuff we need to do here. No materials, no nothing, selection only. And I'm going to grab everything in that front row, and I'm going to export this as well. So this has been a very, although it probably feels slow for you, a very quick process when it comes to building this. Because these trim sheets get reused so much throughout the kit, typically I'm working on these trim sheets for a lot longer. This is the longest part. The modeling part is pretty quick compared to the trim sheet part. I would probably spend another 4 or 5 hours on this trim sheet before I called it ready, and everything would be properly sort of topologied like the other one that I showed you earlier. But for the sake of time, we're going to speed through this. So I've got my export done for my high and my low poly. In this case, the naming doesn't really matter too much. We're just generating a height map with this. So we'll let this go. Oh, there is one thing we need to make sure of though, is I've accidentally left the scale here at 2. So I'm just going to make sure that the scale is applied to everything here, and then I'll re-export that plane. Okay. I would normally use Marmoset for this, but I'll use Painter because that's what you guys have. If you do have Marmoset, I'd recommend doing your height map baking in Marmoset instead. It is just arguably better. But let's use Painter here. I make a new folder, or new file. PBR, regular, same as always. And we're going to make just the trim sheet plane load sheet. We're going 2K because that's the size that we know we decided on it needs to be. And because this is Unreal, we're using DirectX. Everything else can stay the same. Click OK. I now have a flat plane in Substance Painter, which is pretty good. But even better is baking out our height map. So I don't care about any of this right now, except for height and normal. Nothing else matters. I could use the rest if I wanted to texture on this right now, but I might use Designer, we'll see. If you're gonna texture it like this, then we'll leave this and I'll show you how to do that. So drop ID, 2K, use our trim sheet plane high. By default, everything is red because our cage distance is so low. We can just increase that until it's covered everything from the front, and we'll get a clean bake. So we'll try a little bit of anti-aliasing. And then we'll bake. Return to painting. So here we go. We've got our mesh. Some of it's a little bit messed up. That's fine. We can rebake it. Looks like some of the pieces were just sticking out a little bit too much. So what's happening here is because these pieces are crashing through each other, it's creating ambient occlusion in the spots where they're crashing through. To fix that, we have to invert these normals because they're backwards. Re-export. Cool. So I hope you're all quite familiar with baking because it is, as we are seeing here, going to be incredibly useful throughout. There's one last thing I'm going to do just to make my life easier, and that's assign IDs to all of these. What's going on here? I'm going to assign IDs to all of these so that they are easier to texture later. So what I'm going to do now is just make random materials. Doesn't really matter what's going on in them. I'm just going to change the base color a little bit, random amounts for each of the different trims, so that when we're texturing within Painter, we have a mask that we can use for the trims. So new, make this one red. This one can be red. This one can be red. New, make this one some other random color. New, some other random color. If I turn on ID map, you'll see we have a few different options. I just made it use material color. Vertex color is the most consistent one. Material color is the fastest. We'll see if it actually picks up on it or not. It did not. So I might have to use vertex colors, which is fine. For vertex colors, it's more or less the same. I'm just going to go into vertex paint here. And again, just pick a random color, and it's Control X to fill. So next object, vertex paint, Control X to fill. Next object, vertex paint, Control X to fill. So we know all of those have the same. For these ones, vertex paint, we'll pick another random color, Control X to fill. Control X to fill. Control X to fill. I think you get the idea by now, but another random color. We can always color pick off of our other ones later if we choose to change. Control X. And then all of these last ones are going to be the same. Unfortunately, I don't think vertex paint lets you fill them all at once anyway, though. This is why it's a little bit nicer to use materials, but then you have to use FBX files, which can be annoying. All right, way better. Oops, forgot to change this back to vertex color. Still failing. That is weird. Vertex groups.
You're exploring it to the low one.
Good catch. Yeah, that would do it. Thank you. Okay, still failing. What should come up is a color map that's the same as that other color map you can then use to create your masks for these textures. If I was using FBX files, it would probably be okay. But it's freaking out. It's fine. We can just kind of work from here. So with all of that said and done, we can start to build up our texture. And let's just assume that this is some kind of wood. Well, we know it's some kind of wood. Let's create our unique details with the wood. Because we generated all those masks, we can use smart materials. So I can hop in here, pick some kind of smart material, anyone we have, any kind of wood here. I'm gonna cheat a little bit and use the wood I've made in the past, just to kind of speed things up. And then we'll see what we need to adjust to make it all work. So I'm just gonna quickly add a black mask. And then fill everything. And then we'll come in and adjust it until we have kind of what we're looking for. So this is a much larger piece. This isn't enough detail as it is. If we start with just our base, we'll increase the resolution here. We want to make sure that we're using as much of the geometry here as possible, creating additional edge wear and things like that. I'm going to create a new layer on top that we can use for edge. Add a black mask, add a generator, and fill this with curvature. And then we'll work in some of this. So mask. Oops. Black mask. Generator. Curvature. And I just want this one to affect color. Multiply. And adjust. Just to give our edges a little bit more highlight. We can add another layer for dust and things like that. Essentially, you're just texturing this as you would texture any other model. Right, but obviously it's not a model, it's a texture sheet. Doomed a little bit from the start with this one without that ID map, but it's okay. We'll use a dirt generator of some kind. Because this is Painter, this will nice and neatly tile our textures across, which is always good. Just want to adjust some of our layers. Maybe get rid of some of these large streaks that are destroying everything. Paint some more highlights in wherever. Trying to create a lot of color variation in the wood. You can do that by just kind of painting in random details throughout. Use a low opacity. A lot of smaller details put together work a lot better than a lot of super over the top details. If I want this wood to appear a bit older, I might go back to our curvature fill here for our edges, and I'm just going to tweak by adding a slope blur. Now we can adjust it, it's a little excessive. And then I just want to get rid of that diagonal streaking. Cool. Again, something that would normally have a lot more time spent on it, but for the sake of getting through this, we'll kind of work without it. Once we're happy with it, we'll export our textures, same as we've been doing. In this case, for Unreal. But I'm not going to use any of these templates. Once we get into Unreal, we're going to have to make our own materials. So for now, I'm going to export just as it is, and when we're finalized on a workflow, we'll come back and revisit. So everything's going to be a separate map for now. That's okay. We still have our metallic roughness, normal, and base color, which are the key ones that we need. I'm going to export these directly into my engine. We'll go find that. Content, I'm going to add a new folder for textures. PBR metallic roughness, 2K, export. Okay. Now that we have our textures, we can pop back into Blender. I'm going to hide everything here in the trim sheet folder and bring back our objects. From here, we can actually kind of make our textures visible by just adding a new material in our scene and calling this our trim sheet. And realistically, I'm only going to worry about the base color because that will give us a pretty good idea of what's going on. Image texture, open. I'm going to go find the map that I just exported into the project. So that's here, here, here. Textures, base color. Okay, we can pop that open. and we can start to think about UVing these objects. So we've got them nice and neat with the weighted normals. We've got the trim sheet made now. We're going to start UVing these objects using our trim sheet. So I want to just go ahead and unwrap them as flat as possible. I'm going to try and wrap them straight. In this case, because this is the piece that we want to contain the detail here, it's incredibly easy to do. I'm going to rotate it until it fits the scene properly. And then I'm going to use my textile density tool to make sure that this is set to the proper amount. So pixels per meter, 512, set TD. That's not right. It is clearly breaking. Interesting. Oh, wait. My bad. This is set to 512 still. 2048, because that's the size we're actually supposed to be using. 512. There we go. So now we know this is exactly pixel perfect. We can move it to where we want it to go here. Okay, and we see we have that detail showing up. If I export this into the engine now, we know it's set up the way we need it to be. So let's hop in there. This is the bar front. Okay, and now we know these pieces are updated. We have to actually go build the material out. So I'm just gonna make another new folder for materials here. I create a new material. I'm gonna create a super simple material, but I'm just gonna call it the same thing as everything else. We'll jump in and we'll start to build it. I'm gonna make it super simple. It's just gonna be the textures, that's basically it. So texture sample. And this one's gonna be our base color. Control W. Okay. Nothing wants to work today. Oh, I was just duplicating it, but it's deciding duplicating means break everything. So Control W. Okay. Well, maybe that's a Unreal 4 hotkey. So it's Control D now. Okay, so we got base color. We've got metallic. We've got roughness. And we've got our normal map. So later we'll learn about channel packing and like creating more optimized materials, but for now this is fine. We take our normal into our normal, roughness into our roughness, metallic into our metallic, and our base color into our base color. So we can go in here and adjust each of these settings to be our trim sheet. So we have our base color, trim sheet metallic, we have our roughness, and we have our normal. Not going to worry about height here. Okay, I'm going to save and hope it doesn't crash. And we now have created our trim sheet material in Unreal Engine. So again, this is a very basic setup. The materials will get a lot more complicated than this as we move on, but for now it's fine. We're just taking each map and putting it into the appropriate panel here. So if I close this now, I can start to apply this trim sheet to our objects. And we can start to see how these things actually look. So obviously if I apply it to anything that we haven't UV unwrapped yet, it's not going to look very good. But as things get unwrapped, we can start applying this to more and more things and make it look better and better. So as it stands right now, we can take a look at this and see that it is not quite fitting the way we expected it to, which is fine. Part of this is iteration. We can go back and change it. Again, for the sake of time, I'm just gonna start unwrapping everything to give you an idea of what that looks like. So let's just keep unwrapping. I'm gonna take this bottom piece here. We'll get rid of those faces since we no longer need them here, and we're just going to unwrap this one-to-one to our texture sheet for it. So we'll set our textile density here, rotate it, and find that part of our texture, which is right here. Okay, and we can line it up. Some of these need to be perfect, some of them do not. We can re-export this now that it's UV'd. Now all of these pieces will take the trim sheet properly as well. In this case, I am going to get edge cutting between these two 2-meter pieces, so it would be better to go back and make one 4-meter piece for these longer sections, but we'll just kind of keep working away with what we've got right now, where I just want to get this material on as much stuff as possible. Applying it to everything like that is one way to do it. The better way is going to be, of course, to actually go to the mesh and specify what material we're using. And now by default, it contains that material. We can do that for this piece as well. Trim sheet, setup, save, corner piece, etc., etc. Trim sheet, save. So this is kind of repetitive and boring, but if you don't do this stuff from the start, it becomes a huge pain later on. There's a lot of work that goes into actually preparing your assets for use. So with these other sections, we're going to just keep UVing to this new texture sheet that we've made. So we know we have this 4-meter section as well. I'm going to do the same thing. Set our textile density, find the spot on the mesh that it's supposed to be, re-export this with the new UVs. So now that we have everything named already, it is super easy because I can just click and export, and then this will update in Engine. You can see there it was sideways. Quick rotate does the job. Okay, I would go back and fix the trim sheet to match these spaces a little bit better, if time allowed. We can do the same for the modular pieces at the top. Just gonna take these faces here because they'll unwrap flat. Although they're also being weird now. Set TD, find an area where we know it lines up. So we have that big portion there. Same with this. Unwrap, project, grab, set, find the area that lines up. We can use skirts and other things to sort of hide these areas later on. We can unwrap this section. It's going to be straight. set our TD, find the part that we want to use. In this case, let's say we set it up something like this, where we're using this top section. We can do the same for this. So unwrap, grab, rotate, set TD, move roughly into the same spot. Export, export. Okay, it's going to process. I'll just quickly add the trim sheet material to both of these so it's visible. You can see the kind of result we get. One of them is rotated backwards, so I'm just going to flip this around. You can see how quick this makes texturing all these assets. And as long as our trim sheet is up to par, we don't really have to do any work when it comes to these. Trim. Trim. And we could keep going. I'll do this last one for the top, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and look at a little bit more. So this piece, same thing, unwrap, and project from view here to use our setter, and then find that spot on our trim. This is the bar back top. Now again, with these being pieces that are 2 meters, it's only making use of half of the trim sheet. Now that we have this trim sheet, it probably is in our best interest to actually take this, and instead of it making it 2 meters, we're going to take it and we're going to make it 4 meters. Because if we make it 4 meters like this, when we set our textile density, it will line up perfectly with the length of the trim sheet. So we're making the most use of the trim sheet, and it will tile perfectly across. Okay, boom. I have extras now because I had them at 2 meters originally. Apply our trim sheet. And we're good. Okay, so the trim sheet itself, again, not the best quality, but it kind of shows how quickly we can build this up. We've already got good place materials and good base colors and everything like that. We know roughly what our scene's going to look like as we continue to progress. So this last little bit has probably been a little bit boring because it's been a lot of repetitive work. I'm going to take a quick break here before we get into some other stuff, just so it's not totally mind-numbing for you. Now that we actually have 3 hours for lectures again because the strike's over, we can take our time a little bit more. So we'll come back at like probably 10, 20, and then we'll polish up a little bit more stuff, and then we'll go from there. Sound good? Cool. I'll pause the recording here too. Is there any questions? All right, it's 10:20. We'll get back into it. It's still going to be somewhat a lot of the same, but the principles are all kind of covered, so you should have a good idea. What did I just do there? Quickly during that break, I just went through and like resized these pieces that were not the right size and unwrapped the rest of the pieces in this kit, so to speak. There would probably be more pieces in this kit, the back in particular, the bar back here, and if I was to have made the back of the bar, it would also probably be included in this kit. You don't need the kit to take up the entire game. That is an option. but it's not necessary. And oop. Okay, cool. Yeah, so this kit, it doesn't need to take up the entire game. It just needs to take up a portion of our assets. That is the best way to do it. If you really want to get into optimization, as I kind of explored in that library environment, you can use one trim sheet for the entire environment. I did that for a separate project as well, but something like this is more than acceptable. The general idea with this is, as you kind of see here, we're not just unwrapping and texturing each one of these one-to-one. Okay, there is some variation. They're all equal in texel size, so they're all equal as far as the size of the wood detail throughout. We still have our nice high quality details where they lie without us actually having to model any of that in. I'll explore creating these decal bits. We'll have to make a new separate material using transparency. I'll show you how to create those high polys, create those alpha maps, bake those normals into that trim sheet, and then it's essentially more of the same where we're just going to manipulate the UVs to fit over those trims, except the trims are actually decals with alpha. And then the last little bits, I'll just explore what we're going to cover next week and do that whole covering of the submissions that you guys did for the observation assignment, where we'll go over how to create materials for things like this roof and the walls and things like that using tileable textures, material rendering, and blending through vertex painting. So that'll be next week. For right now, to get back to the building of the decals, so we've got a bunch of intricate details in our scene, some of which we might want to model, but most of which are probably too complex. So if I just pull this up, let's look at what I mean. We've got these old school Victorian coin looking things on the fronts of these little pillars. That's something that if you were to model and have that geometry in the game, it's just geometry going to waste. Looking at it at a bigger scale and from the distance that the camera is going to be, you'll never really notice this type of thing. So we don't need to keep these silhouettes. Something like this, with all of this ornate and intricate detail, this is one of those areas where we might want to actually model a good majority of it. Not because it's that much bigger. You could theoretically trim sheet it, but because it really does impact the silhouette of this object. So an object like this, I might split up into where this piece is using the trim sheet, okay? And then I've just got an ornate detail piece or a specific baked part also on that trim sheet. That's what's called a hybrid trim sheet, where we're doing specific bakes of certain parts on the trim sheet, but also the general trims that apply to everything. So that's a hybrid trim. It's a good technique as well, where we can still make use of as much space as possible as long as we have some left over. Now looking at some of these things like these large ornate pieces, man, you really can't see on there, huh? These large ornate pieces, they need all the extra detail in the world. These are things that we are going to want to individually model out. They extrude from the wall in a way where we can't probably fake that with just lighting alone, especially if the player's camera is going to be able to get close to them. So that's going to also need to make use of that hybrid trim sheet technique, where we're going to bake down the normals of this particular part, use a little bit of Photoshop and manipulation to put it on the same map as everything else, except it'll be a separate object altogether. So yeah, that's the basics of what we're going to do real quick. We've got alpha-based trims, and then we've got hybrid trim sheet setups. So let's take a look at this real quick. To start, I'll start with the alpha-based trim sheet setups. This is probably the easiest of the two, and you could use this technique for all of these different pieces as well. These do not necessarily need to have geo. You just have to make sure that you have room on your trim sheet. So we made sure earlier that we have a lot of extra room. If I get rid of my pure ref, in our trim sheet folder here, we've got a bunch of extra room here and here. So let's see which of these we can fit. We know that roughly this piece is this size here. The proportions are a little bit off, but beyond that, we know it's roughly this size. So we know that these pieces are also roughly the size of this, right? Just looking at our reference here, they're roughly the same size. We can look at other reference to kind of confirm this and look for other different pieces. We could use a piece down there. We don't need to take everything from this reference, obviously. I'm just doing that to keep things quick and simple. right? But we could look around and find other things that speak to us. I think generally though, I am gonna go with those weird shapes. So the nice thing about these weird intricate details is that the geometry is not going to matter. We just need that alpha mask. So I don't care about how intricate it is. I'm not going to worry about my topology too much. I'm just going to basically bash this thing with a subdivision surface modifier until it more or less represents the shape that I'm looking for. So that is one nice thing. We'll kind of create a jewel looking thing. It's a little bit hard to tell what exactly is going on here. So we'll have to do a little bit of improv. I'm not the best when it comes to creating these Victorian era designs and things like that, but we'll see what we can get done. I want to start with a plane. That is actually a circle with 8 sides. A lot of these intricate details, you're usually better off, especially if it's flat-ish, you're usually better off trying to make use of a plane and kind of cutting these shapes out before extruding them, than modeling them straight up. Because they have so many bends and curves, we can make use of, what's it called? This one, proportional editing, to help us generate these shapes a bit better. So I'm gonna just immediately pop that's a material. I'm gonna immediately pop a subdivision on here to kind of round this out. And I wanna use / here to isolate this. I just wanna work on this by itself for a little while. If you have a second monitor, that can come really in handy, especially for this kind of stuff, because I can't see my reference as it stands. So let's pop this open, kind of sneak in here. Okay, we've got some kind of convex cone shape followed by some other shape that looks like it kind of feathers in and then goes out. So I'm going to start by just quickly duplicating this, scaling it up and insetting it, and then deleting the interior to give us that second ring. And then I just want to get rid of this top bit so that we have something else to work with. I'm going to inset this a few times and bring it out. All good. Subdivision will handle the smoothness of everything. So we'll just kind of bring our edges out a little bit more and more. I'm not too worried about the thickness of everything. It doesn't need to be watertight, just looking to recreate this shape. So we'll shade that smooth. And we want to get it looking good with as low of a subdiv level as possible first. And then once we're happy with it, we'll kind of pump it up. So we have that second ring. We'll shrink this down. And then I'm going to use proportional editing here. If you don't know what it is, it basically allows you to grab edges nearby and move them in some kind of controlled manner. So if I use proportional editing here, and I want to go change my setting to connected only, because you'll notice right now as I move it, it's moving the other end as well, even though it's not really close to it. If we use connected only, it's going to go via the actual parts that are close to it. And we're just going to kind of elevate this shape out. That's what it was. Then we can delete everything on this side and just mirror this over. So mirror before subdiv, perfect. I want a second portion of this, so I'm gonna extrude this out now. Make sure clipping is turned on. And make sure there's no face in here. Because I want to essentially create another extrusion somewhere from down here. That we can pull out into the shape as well. So again, topology, not really the primary focus right now, it's just getting the shapes. Okay, and then I think these also have a little bit larger ends. So we use proportional editing again to sort of make these pieces bigger. Rotate this one back, it's a little bit crooked. Again, I don't know exactly what I'm dealing with as far as the other side of things here. So we are just kind of making this one up. Proportional adding to get a nice curve. Just root this back. If we think we're kind of happy with the shape, we can bump up the subdiv. And then I'm going to apply the mirror and tweak everything in here to make sure it's all lined up properly. Which it clearly was not. Oops. Merge those and merge these. Okay. We can increase it on this one as well. And I don't know, maybe there's a detail in here. We'll add a new edge and extrude it inwards. And add some support loops. I don't want to add too many support loops and keep things too sharp, because this is going to have to bake down and be visible in the height map. This definitely doesn't really feel Victorian anymore, but we'll kind of just roll with it. And I can add one more kind of plane here. And I'll just split it down the middle and have it kind of come out like this. Looks like I've got nonsense edges again here. Sure. Let's call this good. I really don't know what the actual one looks like. We're just kind of spitballing here. It's a small enough detail, though, it's not going to matter too much. So I'm going to shrink this down now to some extent. We'll bring everything else back in our trim sheet, and we'll find an appropriate place to kind of just pop this in. So we can make it fairly small, find an open spot here, and we'll move this out. So this is where that ID mapping is really going to be basically necessary, because we need a way to tell Substance that, hey, I have object here, but I don't have object around behind it. So I'm going to take this object here, I'm going to give it a material that is just pure white. I'm going to give the background a material that is pure black. Okay, and I'm going to pretend to bake a color map using this data, except because it's just pure black and white, it's actually going to end up being an alpha map. So anything that has thickness, which is basically everything we have so far, since the ID map wasn't working anyway, we're just going to copy that material. So look in the material preview, we have this black and white. This is going to be our alpha mask. It's going to become our alpha mask for using these decals later. I could create a bunch of variations of these or do that other big one, but for now we'll just leave this as it is, as the one. And I'm again going to export these, this time as FBX because I need these material colors to go through, although even then this might cause issues. Just going to call this alpha high. And then the low can be the same one. So I'm going to save the file that we do have, and we'll just make a separate file to bake down the alpha specifically. Realistically, it doesn't matter if we bake the alpha in the same file because it's all going to be the same texture size and it's all going to fit into the same plane texture. So let's put this away. And this is our trim sheet. Make a new folder or a new file with this now low poly. This is alpha low. Same texture size as the other one to make sure it's all consistent. Click OK. And we bake again. But this time the only one I actually care about is baking that ID map. Use material color and bake. And it should, nope. It should allow us to use the material ID, except it is really not enjoying doing that. Did that work? Oh, it did. Okay. So it's a little rough around the edges, but it has more or less baked down a map that we can use as an alpha later on. The one issue is there's a lot of padding, so I'm going to try and kill the padding because what's happening here is it's coming around our shape and then it's padding out into the additional UV space. So let's try this again. Material color, common settings. I'm going to turn my padding off, basically. Where is the padding? I'm starting to think you can't actually change the padding in Substance Painter. Okay, this is a little bit disappointing. Let's try that one. There we go. All right, so padding is actually dilation width, apparently. I'm just going to set this to 1 for a single pixel of padding. There we go. Return to painting. So now we have a proper, actually, alpha map that we can use for this. It's not entirely done yet. We do have to kind of take it and add the black background to it. So I'm just going to go File, Export Textures. It's a little bit roundabout, but it gives us access to everything we need. Just going to go to my desktop. And I don't actually want to export the maps that we made. I just want to export the mesh maps. So if I go down here to mesh maps, you can see it'll export all of the ones that we have here. The one that's not exporting is ID map, which is weird because we have it turned on. Not a fan of Substance Painter for this kind of stuff. I would be using Marmoset, but this is what you have. So to get around the fact that you can't export ID maps by default, I am going to add a fill to my base color. And then in my fill, in the base color, I'm just going to plop that ID map in. Which has decided to not exist in my file. Generator. Fun. Add fill, color map, base color. Okay. Second fill for the background, that's just pure black. There we go. Now we have a proper alpha map. And we're ignoring everything else. We just want base color. We can export our one texture. Okay, on our desktop now we have our unusual. We have our alpha map, black where we don't want alpha, and white where we do. Now we can go back to our original bake. High, low poly is the same. We'll hop into our trim sheet folder. And do a quick rebake with our new high poly. It looks a little bit funky because we have this one-to-one bake here, but it's okay because we have the alpha mask that's going to allow us to isolate just the part we want when it comes to actually putting this in the engine. So I'm going to re-export these textures now. So this will update everything in engine the way we need it to, which nothing has actually changed in engine. We've just added that one extra part, but since none of these UVs are actually going over it, nothing changes. Then we can hop in here. Instead of this trim sheet material, what I'm going to do is jump in. And by default, we have a few different types: surface, deferred decal, etc., opaque. We want this core one to be just a surface opaque material because this is the easiest for the engine to render. So if I go into show here, and then I should have a visualizing setting for shader complexity.
Shading models? Does that work?
No, it's shading complexity. I'm on Unreal 4 knowledge here, but it should be a part of this as well. Oh, buffer visualization, no. Optimization, shader complexity. There we go. Okay. This is one of the debug modes in Unreal Engine. Useful for when you're working with complex shaders. Essentially, it tells you if your shader is good or bad. So as you can see, we've got this bar here where green is good and white is bad. So these regular surface opaque shaders are extremely light for Unreal to handle. As soon as I change this from opaque to translucent, nothing really changes here. But just by virtue of being translucent, it is now almost 3 times the rendering and processing time. So we want to limit the amount of translucency we have as much as possible. And when we do have it, we want to isolate it in its own little material. So I'm not going to make this material translucent. I'm going to leave this one as opaque, the way it has been. I'm going to make a duplicate of this material called trim sheet alpha. And this one we can make transparent or use defer decal to handle that kind of stuff. So we'll go service and masked. Okay, and then we have this little thing for opacity mask here, so we can take that alpha we made and dump it into our opacity mask. So save this here. Grab the alpha, it's on the desktop. And just drop this in. Something else I did during the break there that I'm not going to worry about too much now, that's more of when we talk about shaders and workflows and stuff, is each one of these on import needs to be treated with its proper settings. So by default, they are all compressed with DXT. Normal maps need to be compressed with DXT5, and masks like this or grayscales options need to be changed to their respective compression settings. So for this, I'm going to use a mask. It's very high detail for no sRGB. Save, and now that information should be stored properly. So let's hop back into that material, which I closed. We can duplicate another one of these, and instead of our roughness, this will be our alpha mask. And we switch this to our alpha mask. Okay, we can basically use any channel since it is a mask. The green channel does hold the most information typically, just the way compression works. You don't really need to know much about that other than that's how it is. So now we can see with this material, we are seeing everything except where our decal is. So we can save that. So as you saw, using translucency absolutely nukes our performance. Using alpha-based blending that's masked is not the end of the world. You could add this to the original material, but anything to optimize further is always good. So if we turn shader complexity now, you can see it is just so barely more complex than the standard surface shader. Okay. The caveat with this is that it only works if you have 0 or 1 on your alpha. You can't have any in between. If you have a surface like glass or anything that needs to be somewhat reflective or somewhat transparent, anything between 0 or 1, you can't get away with using opacity masks. You have to use something like a translucent material, and that's why you should keep it separate. For this, it is fine. After doing this quick test, we can determine, hey, this is okay. This is not so complex that it's going to break our game. So I am going to go back to our default trim sheet, and we are going to work with a masked opacity. So we can change this now, plop this into our opacity mask. Nope, forgot to change the name. Opacity, and then roughness. Save. Okay, great. So we're still within a good shader range. We can delete our test material. And we can start to actually add these alpha bits. So just like everything else, the process is the same for making the UVs. I'm going to hide the trim sheet. I'm going to hide this circle thing. Let's put it in the trim sheet. Pull out our building blocks again. And I'm just going to grab the piece that they go on. So that would be this one here. Now I just want to create a floater. So I'm going to just grab the plane where this is going to go. duplicate it and just move it out ever so slightly, making sure that's off, right? Okay, and this floating piece, I'm going to UV unwrap it to that new decal we just made. And because of the alpha masking, it's going to hide the other parts. So let's go back to UV editing. Grab this. And one benefit to this as well is it doesn't need to be exactly 512. We have this detail here. It might fit exactly, it might not. In this case, it looks like it actually just does fit the pixel density perfectly. But you could have a larger or smaller decal and it's okay because it's floating on this space. It's not going to interrupt too much. So let's take another look at this now. In Blender, it is going to look a bit funky because we don't have the opacity mask set up. So let's rotate this until it's the correct orientation. And I'm going to grow this up a bit just so it kind of fits. Again, remember, everything in this area that's not this decal is going to disappear in Unreal. If we really wanted to, we could replicate that here just by going to Alpha, Image, and doing the exact same thing. All right, so you could recreate everything in Blender that we're creating in the Unreal shader, and then you can get a one-to-one representation, but typically the way I like to do it is just get close enough and you can export it to the engine quickly to see what it's supposed to look like. Blender, because it's Blender, no longer pre-computes shaders, so you just have to give it a second while it does this. And we'll open that from our desktop, just because it's there. Okay. And it's broken anyway because Blender. This is not channel packs. Yeah, anyway, there's a way to do that in Blender too. I prefer to just take it, we'll put it in Unreal. This is the bar front pillar, boom. And we have it there. Okay, we can see where the alpha is actually cutting it out, but generally speaking, everything is there. If we wanted to as well, we could make this whole piece smaller. And to take it a step even further, when we're actually in Painter here, what we can do is create a new material that's going to represent this part. So I will make a new fill out of black mask. And normally this is where that ID mask really comes in handy, because I want this to be its own material. We can make this metallic. I can paint this area in. I would assume that this piece would be metallic. I don't actually know. And now when I re-export these textures as well, that's going to have that metallic detail. Okay. And we can continue to do this for all of the other bits and pieces that we have that we want to add one by one to our trim sheet. So now just that one tiny detail has added a lot to our scene. We would do the same thing for the little lights that are all up in here, or the little ornate pieces up in here where we have them sculpted out and baked first, and then follow the exact same process to build up an alpha to use on those pieces. So that's the decal workflow of things. If you were following along there, it's not too complicated or anything, it's just a little bit roundabout trying to make your alphas. The reason I use Marmoset is because it will just bake that and you don't have to filter your ID mask or whatever mask you choose to use into something else. You could also, of course, go into Substance, and if you're going to use Substance from the start, you can use opacity masking right away. So in here, we do have an option for opacity. And then when I export, I can just export that opacity mask with 0 and 1, and as long as it's 0 and 1, it'll work as a mask in Engine. So that's the general gist of it. It'll also, if you do it this way, will show up better here because it won't show the padding. But either way works as long as your opacity is set up in Engine. Okay. Obviously, you would want to remove any wood details or anything from your metal bits, but the point still stands. Any questions about that little bit, the decal stuff? Why we used opacity masking and not translucency, and how to make the opacity masks? If you're absolutely struggling with the alpha and like generating the alpha, there's nothing wrong with literally going into Photoshop and painting it out bit by bit and just using the wand tool to like find the background. That's totally fine too. As long as you create the maps, it doesn't matter how you do it. Okay, so that's it for today as far as building up the scene. I think we're in a pretty good spot. If you were following along, your environment would be in a place like this. Don't pack up, wait. Oh, it's 11 a.m., holy smokes. Okay. Until they kick us out then, real quick, I'm gonna end this recording and then I'm gonna just go over submission problems real quick, if that's all right with you. It'll be areas where there were a lot of mistakes that happened quite frequently.